The use of codes in assessment is used in many countries throughout the world. In South Africa, we use the 7-point scale coding system, which is probably the most popular one throughout the world. Now, the most important thing for us to remember with codes and when assigning codes to learners is that the coding system is based on skills and not content. Therefore, the learner's skills and level of cognitive ability should be reflected in the codes that they receive, and not just the amount of content and knowledge that they have. So what we often find is that the code that the learner receives is not always reflective of their actual ability. So you might find as a teacher you get a learner that arrives in your grade or in your class and they have a code 6, and you look at them and think there's no way that this learner actually should be getting a code 6. And there's one fundamental reason why this often happens, and it's because there's too much knowledge and recall in our curriculum, and often in tests and assessments that we set, there's too much knowledge required. So that's your learning off by heart, rather than interpreting and thinking at different cognitive levels. So in a case like this, you've got a learner who receives a code 6 because of the knowledge that they got and the marks they got for that knowledge. Yet, if you look at their actual ability and their skills, it doesn't represent the same level. Let's use a more practical example. And often we find the difficulty that teachers have is actually in the interpretation of the different codes. So let's use the 7-point scale. If we say that the coding system is based on skills rather than content, I'm going to use the analogy of an aeroplane. Now let's say next week I'm getting on an aeroplane, I'm flying from Cape Town to Port Elizabeth. When I get on that aeroplane, I am assuming that the pilot has a certain set of skills. One of those skills, we hope, is to be able to land that plane. Now, the fact that the pilot can land that plane does not give him a 7. The fact that he can land that plane actually gives him a 4. How well he lands that plane, or how badly he lands that plane or doesn't land that plane, that'll determine on the scale how far up and down he goes. So the fact that he can land the plane gives him a 4. If the weather is terrible, there's a big storm and one of the engines fails, but he still manages to do a smooth landing, that would take him up further the scale, either to a 5, a 6, or a 7. So what we find is when people are assessing learners, as soon as a learner can do something, they tend to give them a 7, which is not correct. Your level 4 is what we call the can and can't do level. That's the level at which the learner is able to achieve the curriculum. So if a learner is able to do something, and remember we're talking skills now, not knowledge, if they're able to do something, then they get a level 4. How well they can do that may give them a level 5, 6, or 7. And we need to be really careful about this, and we need to have a common understanding within subjects, within grades, of how we award these codes. Now, another really useful tool to use is the bell curve, and it's often seen in a very negative light, but it really is useful for us to reflect on, are we accurately awarding these codes? Now, without getting too technical about the bell curve, if you have a look at the bottom axes, you've got the codes spread out from 1 to 7. What each of those little lines represent are the number of learners who fall into those codes. So if you have a look at it without trying to measure or anything like that, you will notice that between codes 3 and 5, your largest group of learners fall into that group. Between codes 0 and 3, you have a smaller group, possibly 25% of the learners, and from codes about 5.5 or halfway between 5 and 6 and 7, you've also got a small group of learners. So what this is telling us is that the majority of learners, if we are assessing, teaching correctly and at the right levels and using skills, then we should have the majority of our learners lying between codes 3 and 5. Now, of course, it's not always going to work like this because every school's different, every group of learners is different. But what is really important to see is the shape of the curve. So you might have a particularly weaker group of learners, in which case your curve may be to the left. So you're not going to have any 7s. You'll see there's nothing represented under 7, and the majority of your learners are between codes 2 and 4. But the code, the shape of the bell curve is still the same. You might have a particularly strong group of learners where you've got no ones, yet you've got a larger number falling under the 6s and 7s, but still your biggest group is between 4 and 5 and then up to 6. And then of course you could have a really bright group, and this is what we'll find if we were to take all the marks in the country. You can have some schools that are performing on the right hand side, that light blue line, where most of their learners are sitting 6s and 7s. The danger of this is, when you're assessing at a school level, if you have all your learners just getting 6s and 7s and you don't have that shape of the curve, it means a couple of things. It means either you're focusing too much on content and you're ignoring the skills, because the skills is what divides a group of learners into the different categories, or you're not challenging your top learners enough. Because you can't tell me that your entire class is 6s and 7s. You've got to challenge them. At the exit exams, your grade 12 exam in South Africa would be your leveling plane. Then you might have all your learners getting high results. But up until that point, you need to push those learners to make sure you get the best out of them. Now, although in South Africa we have a table which explains what the different levels are of the codes and what they mean, the descriptions really aren't clear enough. So you look at the difference between a code 3, 4, and 5. I'm not too sure the difference between moderate, adequate, and substantial. So we need to make sure that we understand what each of the codes mean. And this is where, as I said earlier, schools often fail because the teachers don't have this discussion about what do we understand about each of these codes. If I'm giving a learner code 4, what does it mean when you're giving a learner code 4? So what I'd like to quickly look at is, what are the codes and their real meanings? And we're going to go through this chart and look at each of these aspects individually. So what does it mean to get a code 1? What does it mean to get a code 5? The important thing here is to realize that this can be applied to any subject. We're looking at skills rather than facts. Now, the first level, which is what we call the acquisition of facts. This is the knowledge and facts, and this is where a learner may well know the facts and may even know all of them, but the facts aren't applied or commented on in any way. So anything at a factual level means that a learner would get a code 1. The implication of this for our teaching is that if we set a test or exam where the learners can go home and learn everything off by heart and come back and it's all pre-learned information, even if they get 80-90% for that paper or that assessment, they are still only functioning at a code 1 level. And this is what we need to bear in mind. Now, code 2, the linking of knowledge, basically means that the learner is able to make obvious connections and simple conclusions using the facts and knowledge that they've gained. The linking indicates some basic understanding. A learner receiving a code 3 is able to apply the knowledge. So although the learners may struggle with the structural and comprehension skills, they have all the important facts and they can show basic understanding of them. They may be provided some examples, but not always explaining their understanding clearly. A learner receiving a code 4, and this is the most important level because this is what we call the can and can't do level. This is the level that the curriculum is based on. So here a learner provides a clear and logical connection of facts. Factual information is linked in a logical sequence, and it's suitably explained, and they show clear understanding as to why they've been sequenced and linked in the way they have. Code 5 is the application of the skill. So you can see now we're getting more and more into the skills and the ability of the learner to actually apply the skills. At this level, the learner is able to apply the skill to various contexts. They can apply and produce original examples, and their ideas are used to link facts to create a better understanding of the content and the factual information. Now that we're getting to code 6, remember this is a small portion of your learners who should be functioning on this level. There are very few learners who have these skills that are so developed. This learner or these learners are able to draw new and logical conclusions, and they're able to use the skills they have to show creative and insightful thought processes. Now, if you think about the learners in your class, Very few of them are able to do that. Yet many of your learners are probably receiving a code 6, even though they're not able to do that. So you need to ask yourselves, those learners receiving code 6s and 7s, are they able to actually function at this skill and cognitive level? Now, your highest code is your innovation level. And these are learners that they really stand out above everyone else. They're innovative, they're able to use information and skills that they've developed themselves, and they can combine these and develop new skills to put them really into a class of their own. One of the most important things about these learners is everything they write and everything they do inspires others to think differently. So if you've got a learner doing an oral, in order for them to get a code 7 or function on a code 7 level, they must have brought in new ideas, things that you hadn't thought of before, and they really get those other learners and yourself to think differently. And that puts them in a class of their own. So I challenge you to go back and look at the codes that you've awarded. Look at the learners and ask yourself, do they really function on that skill level? And if you find that your codes that the learners are getting are too high, you're possibly assessing too many facts and teaching only facts, and also that you're not challenging your top learners. And the way to challenge our top learners is not to give them more work, it's to give them deeper thinking work.